597 and then 586. Others will skip 605, starting with 597, which is the fall of Jerusalem. The reason for taking 605 as the first of the deportees is that was when Daniel was taken into captivity. So a little back history on that is that in 612, the Babylonians and the Medes conquered Assyria. 605, the Babylonians battled Egypt at Carchemish, and that comes into our text as well, where there's discussions about Egypt coming up here pretty soon. In 605, Nebuchadnezzar came to the throne of Babylon, and then in 605, the Babylonians invaded Judah for the first time, and that's when Daniel was taken into captivity. So whether you use this set of three deportation waves, or if you use the one that starts 597, 598, and then 586, we still end up with several waves. So everybody did not go out all at the same time. I think that's the main point there. So Ezekiel was taken with some of the other important people, the cream of the crop of the Israelite society, and he began his ministry. He was taken in 597, began his actual ministry in 593. Now, how are we going to read this text or any other text well in order to gain the most information that we can from it, and then from that understand how to bring it into our own lives today? One sort of rubric that I use, or a heuristic device that I use, is something called text world theory. And it talks about language. It talks about how the text is something that builds a world in our mind. It was actually something that caught my eye when I was writing my thesis. The person who started it is a man called Paul Wirth, and his paper was called How to Build a World in Less Than 6 Days Using Only What's in Your Head. I was very captivated by his title and also by the way that he works with the language itself. So this allows us to take a little bit of a close read, but a principled close read where we're looking for certain things. And people who I've had in class before, I think I've introduced to this as well, both in Old Testament and other Old Testament book classes. So I'll let you in on some of the terminology here. The first idea is that there's a class of terms called world builders. In other words, they're elements that when we read them, that we begin to build a mental model of what's happening in the text. They build the background world. And these world builders are things like time, location, characters, and objects. And oftentimes you'll see, even in our commentary today, that commentators will take these issues one by one as they're building up information for the reader to understand the text. And so text world theory is sort of a little bit more of a tight use of things that are already used in biblical studies. And it builds one sort of holistic way of looking at things as opposed to looking at these things as separate issues. So the things that these all have in common then, time, location, characters, and objects, are that they build sort of a background world that the action takes place in. Okay? Now, these are, importantly for us, these are within the text. So our interaction with the text would be something that Paul Wirth would call working with a discourse world. We're reading a text that was written by somebody else. And so you can see how these layers need to be accounted for. But we can focus in, from our own perspective here, upon the text and look for these kinds of things. So when we look at the idea of time, sometimes this is hard in prophetic books, but with Ezekiel, he gives you right in verse 1:1, in the 30th year. And conveniently, that sounds very concrete, and except we have to ask, in the 30th year of what? Okay. Are we talking about Ezekiel's actual age? Was it in his 30th year? That's not necessarily quite so likely because he already was a priest when he came, and the priests began to work later, like in their 30th year. The time in Babylon, had they been there for 30 years when he began to prophesy? Probably not. So we want to drill down on that a little bit if we can at some point to find out if we can locate it in the 30th year of what in particular. The location is something we can know more about because pretty much across the board, people agree that he prophesied from exile in Babylon. So you can read the arguments for this. However, I think Paul Joyce brings it right back to the idea that Babylon was his likely site for the events that he was when he was prophesying. And this entire enterprise was different than what happened with the Assyrians. So it was not such a bad situation as when the Israelites were taken by the Assyrians. There they were divided up and sent out, and basically the entirety of society was broken up. The Babylonians kept the society more together, and as Jeremiah said, settle down, build homes, grow some trees, make yourself comfortable. You're going to be there for 70 years. And for some, that was their entire lifetime. So the advice was to sort of settle in, not to wander about, but to be productive, in other words. And the Jewish people were productive in that setting. In fact, this is where the Babylonian Talmud arose, and this is still an important document for Jews today. So you have a Jerusalem Talmud and a Babylonian Talmud, and so we have two definite cultural artifacts that have come up and have been used ever since that came from both of those two different areas. Okay? All right, so for characters, we see the cast of characters, particularly in the early parts of Ezekiel, with two strong, rounded characters, and that would be God and Ezekiel. And the topic of their discussion is often the Israelites. Okay, so the main character, main actor is, in fact, God. And this is why the book of Ezekiel comes across with the sense of a powerful God, a strong God. Ezekiel is continually in awe of the Son of Man, of God. And God is portrayed in this strong and powerful way. So we can see, even as a character, we have a transcendent kind of God. Okay. The objects, looking for objects in a text sometimes is a little not so exciting, but here in the book of Ezekiel, the objects that appear are very interesting. Number one, we have the chariot throne with all of its fantastic details, the different faces, the different wheels, just the presentation of God on this throne is quite amazing. And then the second case, I think of the sign axe. Take a brick and make it the city. Lay on your side and make bread. And this bread is really very interesting because the type of grain that would have been collected there is not some esoteric mix of grain that was excellent and wonderful for your health. It was actually representative of the sweepings off the floor. In other words, there really wasn't very much going to be left there. So just take what you can find on the floor and make it into bread. And in fact, there may not be anything to burn it with, so you might have to burn it with your own dung. Here we find one interesting sort of thing, just to jump forward to some of the textual highlights. The idea of the making the bread over human dung allows Ezekiel to exert his priestly interest. He comes before God and he goes, I've never eaten anything unclean. So we see there this influence of his priestly behavior. And, pardon me, the interest in that is that God changes his mind. It says, okay, you can use something else. So that's an interesting thing, that priestly protestation of I've never eaten anything unclean is received by God, and God sort of changes his mind and gives a new thing to do. Let's look at some of the textual highlights. There are many in chapters 1 through 7 from last week that we could go into, and I would love to sit down and have a chat within a classroom setting with all of you about these because they are so interesting. We'll have to make do a little bit here with a recording and some comments from you later on. However, I want to specifically point out the call account, in 1 through 3. And you can see more of my own thinking and study in the paper that was included last week on the role of visionary experiences. But let's talk a little bit about the idea of what a call account does. And in this case, the call account is a rhetorical device, and the rhetorical device is used to authorize the prophet to speak for God. So the entire reason we have this in here is not simply because it's interesting, but because it authorizes the prophet's speech. Therefore, here in Ezekiel, it comes quite to the front of the books, likewise in Jeremiah. The interesting thing about Isaiah, if we were talking about that, is that it comes in chapter 6. So another one for the Isaiah formation kind of idea, that we don't have a chronological text in the book of Isaiah in quite the same way we do in Ezekiel. Ezekiel is very well ordered. Again, possibly because of his own experience of being a priest, where orderliness was something to be aimed for. 6 features could be present in a call account. Number 1, pardon me, I'm apparently jet-lagged today. Number 1, an encounter with God. Number 2, an introductory word. Number 3, a commission. Then inevitably an objection. Number 5 would be a reassurance from God, and number 6 would be some type of a sign. So you see those features more or less in each of the major prophetic books, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And it's interesting to read. Other interesting textual highlights are the point in time in which Ezekiel is instructed to eat the scroll. In other words, he's supposed to internalize the words of God from the scroll. And then other interesting textual highlights here too include the sign acts that Ezekiel was to do. Now, other prophets had various visions, but I don't recall quite so many sign acts being performed by the prophet, taking a brick, using it as a model of the city, or the laying on one side, baking siege bread from the floor sweepings and dung, and so forth. All of these are very distinctly Ezekiel. And one just wonders what the response of people around him would be. I think it would be quite surprising to walk down into the city square and see somebody laying on their side, and so forth and so on. Okay? Now, the chariot throne vision was embraced by the early Christian communities and interpreted in an interesting kind of way. I've included for you a link on the page that I sent out by email that contains the notes for this talk. And I wanted to point out that the chariot throne vision in early Christian communities, especially as illustrated by the Christ or God being carried by the 4 evangelists, is something that comes from the Armenian interpretation. And I've included a link for you to look. Now, if you go to that link and scroll down almost all the way, you'll see one of the more interesting pictures I've seen of Ezekiel and his throne vision. And that is that it shows Christ, God, at the top. And Ezekiel, we have the creatures on one side and the wheels on the other. And Ezekiel is talking with God. Also, in that picture, you'll see a scroll being handed down. And I thought that was a really interesting take. So do take a little moment to look up that image online and have a look at all the details. It's really fascinating. And notice also the way that the gold paint is used underneath and around the divine in that one. Now, earliest hearers and readers of Ezekiel would not have pictured that as Christ. This was a picture that has come up through interpretive means in the Christian community. But it does make us wonder, what would the early Jewish readers and hearers do with that idea of the Son of Man? How would they conceptualize the Son of Man? Because Ezekiel is careful to say, I saw one like the Son of Man. Okay, he did not claim to see the Son of Man, but one like the Son of Man, which also then makes us wonder, what was he expecting if he was going to see the Son of Man? So there are all kinds of interesting things happening in here. And the reason why I gave you a Christian interpretation right now is so you can compare it with what we're actually reading in the book itself. And look at what the book gives us, and then look at what happens with early Christian interpretation, where now we have 4 Gospels. We have the idea that each of these 4 creatures is representative of one of the Gospel writers. And in fact, the Gospel writers each seem to have acquired an animal identity with them as well. So in early Christian art, you'll see certain of the Gospel writers being associated with a certain animal. So finally, I want to help you to engage this week with the idea of shifting audiences, just as I've discussed right here with the difference between an early Jewish audience and then the very earliest of Christian audiences. We want to see the effect of shifting audiences at the point of sort of what we would call reception history. And in my view, early Christian writings, even as the Gospels and the New Testament, are basically the earliest form of reception history of the Old Testament. In other words, the Christian writers already were using the Old Testament in their theological and moral thinking, and now they begin to bring some of those ideas into the writings that then become our New Testament. So we're going to dip our foot into some pretty deep waters this week. This is not going to be an easy task necessarily. But what I want you to do is look at some of the allusions to Ezekiel that are found in New Testament. And the reason we want to do this is to see how New Testament writers engaged with those ideas and brought them into their own argumentation. Okay, so we'll begin to see that the entirety of our Christian canon is not simply an smoothly presented tablecloth on which we can put our plates, but rather it's a jumble. It's more a bed sheet that's been used and crumpled up. So we have to take it and sort of smooth out the edges and see what we're actually looking at. Because our view of the Old Testament is colored by the New Testament writers, and the New Testament writers' writings were colored by the text that we now call the Old Testament. But for them was the full Hebrew Bible. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We're going to do a project now that we'll kind of revisit at the end of term, and that includes looking at the allusion that you'll find in Ezekiel, or from Ezekiel, in a New Testament setting. So in the forum, I've presented you with a photo that I took from the back of a Greek New Testament, where they have lists of both direct quotations and allusions. And the allusions are interesting because they take a concept and sort of the concept is reused rather than the specific set of words themselves. So you'll choose one. Look through the list of allusions found in the New Testament from the parts of Ezekiel we've already read, and that's up through chapter 13. So you can pick any one or pick two and look at how the New Testament writer actually sort of reuses it. You want to, according to this, look for the speaker, who's talking, the hearers, who's being addressed, and the historical social setting for the text. So it'll be easy enough that you can go back in on last week's introductory matters to find this information for Ezekiel. But when you come to your New Testament book, which for many of you will be Revelation, you may want to go back online to the International Commentary and have a look at that book, the introduction for that book, and see the historical and social setting for how this text is used within its new context. Okay, so we're searching back and forth. There's more instructions in the forum post itself, but I wanted to kind of talk through that a little bit and explain why we're even going to do this exercise. And I think it's a really fun exercise, and it helps us to read well. It helps us to see how our reading then can influence our theology. So thanks for this run through. I will try to put together another short talk so that we can talk through some of this week's material. Do please be in touch with the course question forum and on emails. I'm still out of the country, so telephoning is probably not a great idea, but I am very glad to Skype. If anybody feels like you want a face-to-face discussion, we could actually do that by Skype. So for now, we'll talk to you soon. Enjoy your week.